And I just got a phone call. And it was like, I think it was like that for everyone. It was just so horrific. You couldn't take it in, and I couldn't take it in.
When most people think of Paul McCartney, they picture a cheerful musician with a warm smile and countless hit songs. But beneath this friendly image lies someone who is deeply sensitive and easily hurt by criticism. Recently, in a rare moment of honesty, McCartney revealed something shocking. He keeps a personal list of people he truly despises. This list includes former friends who betrayed him, music legends who stole from him, and people who destroyed what he loved most. For decades, he has kept these feelings hidden, but now we can understand why these relationships turned so bitter. Paul McCartney was born in 1942 into a working-class family in Liverpool, England. When he was just 14 years old, his mother died of breast cancer. This tragedy left a deep mark on him, but it also pushed him toward music as a way to heal his pain. In 1957, Paul met John Lennon at a church festival. They quickly became close friends and, along with George Harrison and Ringo Starr, formed the Beatles, one of the most famous bands in history. Paul played bass guitar, sang many of the lead vocals, and was one of the main songwriters for the band. Over more than 60 years in music, he became not just world famous, but also incredibly wealthy, with a fortune estimated at over $1 billion. In 1997, Queen Elizabeth II knighted him for his contributions to music. Yet behind all this success, there were always shadows and conflicts. Paul was known for being extremely difficult to work with and a perfectionist who demanded everything be done exactly right. He would often make the band record the same song dozens of times until it met his standards. While this attention to detail helped the Beatles create amazing music, it also made his bandmates angry and frustrated. George Harrison sometimes walked out of recording sessions in anger, and John Lennon even wrote a song mocking Paul. McCartney never hid his ambition to be seen as equal to, or even better than, John Lennon. This drive earned him a reputation for having a big ego and being calculating about his career. While Lennon was seen as the dreamer and rebel of the group, McCartney was the practical one who focused on business deals and protecting their music rights. This business sense helped him have a career that lasted for decades, but it also made him enemies among fellow musicians. To the public, Paul has always appeared to be the friendly Beatle, always smiling and positive. But in private, he is actually very sensitive to criticism and easily hurt. There were times when he fell into deep depression, drank too much alcohol, and felt so broken that he could not write music at all. These emotional scars made him withdraw into himself, and for decades he rarely spoke about his personal conflicts with others. But recently, in an honest conversation with reporters, McCartney admitted for the first time that he really does have a list of famous people he absolutely hates. According to him, this list represents the deepest wounds of his life that have never healed. The first person on his list is Michael Jackson, who Paul sees as a brother who betrayed him. In the early 1980s, Paul and Michael were close friends. They spent time together and even collaborated on music. Paul saw Michael as a younger brother, while Jackson looked up to Paul as an experienced veteran in the music industry. During one of their conversations, Paul shared what he thought was friendly advice about how to succeed in the music business. He told Michael that buying the rights to other artists' songs was a smart investment that could provide steady income for years. Paul never expected Michael to use this advice against him. In 1985, ATV Music, the company that owned most of the Beatles' song copyrights, was put up for sale. Michael Jackson, who was at the peak of his career and had plenty of money, decided to buy it. For about $47.5 million, Michael officially acquired this huge catalog of music, which included most of the Beatles' greatest hits. For Paul, this felt like a knife in the back. He was devastated because he had been the one to give Michael the idea of investing in music copyrights, and he never imagined that the King of Pop would use this knowledge to take control of the Beatles' legacy. After this business deal, the friendship between Paul and Michael completely fell apart. Years later, when Michael faced financial problems, many people expected him to sell the Beatles' copyrights back to Paul, but that never happened. Instead, Michael partnered with Sony to continue controlling the catalog for many more years. Paul has said in many interviews that this was one of the biggest mistakes and betrayals of his life. His once beautiful friendship with Michael Jackson ended in bitterness, and Paul has never forgiven him. He has stated directly that he felt completely betrayed, saying he thought they were friends, but Michael turned it into a cold business deal. This betrayal was just the beginning of a series of deep wounds in Paul's life. The second person on Paul's hate list is even more painful, because it involves his closest creative partner and former best friend, John Lennon. Paul and John were like soulmates who wrote over 200 timeless songs together. The Lennon-McCartney partnership became legendary in music history, even though in reality, many songs were primarily written by just one of them rather than as true collaborations. But starting in the mid-1960s, the distance between them began to grow. John had the sweet, innocent image that Paul was building for himself and the Beatles, while Paul was annoyed by John's wild lifestyle and increasingly erratic behavior. When Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, died unexpectedly, the band immediately fell into chaos. Paul wanted the band to continue making music and moving in new creative directions, but John was bored with being a Beatle and wanted to break free to find his true self with his new girlfriend, Yoko Ono. This difference in vision caused constant arguments between Paul and John. Paul wanted to control the band's musical direction and keep them together, while John accused Paul of being an artistic dictator who would not listen to anyone else's ideas. George Harrison became so frustrated with Paul's demanding behavior that he once left a recording session because he could not stand Paul's constant instructions. The conflict reached its worst point when the Beatles finally broke up. Paul took the drastic step of suing his own bandmates in court to dissolve their business partnership, Apple Corps. John saw this legal action as the ultimate betrayal. In 1971, John wrote a song called How Do You Sleep on his album Imagine. In this song, he directly attacked Paul with cruel lyrics, suggesting that Paul's only meaningful contribution to music was his song Yesterday, and that everything else he had done was worthless. Paul was deeply hurt by this public attack. For years afterward, he repeatedly mentioned this song in interviews, saying how painful it was to hear John sing such mean things about him. Paul also fought back with his own subtle attacks in songs like Too Many People, which included hidden insults directed at John and Yoko. But fate played a cruel trick. While these musical insults were still echoing, the chance for the two former friends to reconcile slowly began to fade. Then, before Paul could say a word of forgiveness or make peace with John, a gunshot in New York City forever took John's life and closed the door on any possibility of reconciliation. The third person Paul hates is Mark David Chapman, the disturbed man who killed John Lennon and destroyed any chance the Beatles could ever reunite. On December 8, 1980, a dark cloud hung over New York City as John Lennon was assassinated right in front of the Dakota building where he lived with Yoko Ono. The killer, Mark David Chapman, was a 25-year-old man who had once been a fan of the Beatles, but had developed a sick obsession with John and had serious mental problems. That morning, Chapman waited quietly outside John's apartment building. When John left to go to a recording studio, Chapman approached him and asked him to sign his copy of John's latest album, Double Fantasy. John smiled, signed the album, and left, completely unaware that just a few hours later, the same man would pull a gun and end his life. Around 10 p.m., when John and Yoko returned home, Chapman was hiding in the shadows near the building entrance. As soon as John walked toward the doorway, Chapman pulled out a handgun and fired 5 shots quickly. 4 of them hit John in the back. Blood stained the steps of the Dakota building as John collapsed in Yoko's arms, only able to say, "I've been shot," before losing consciousness. Chapman just stood there calmly, opened his copy of the book, The Catcher in the Rye, and waited for police to arrest him. When Paul heard the news that John had been killed, he was completely shocked and devastated. As he left his own recording studio that day, reporters surrounded him, pushing microphones in his face and shouting questions like, "Paul, what do you think about John being shot?" Paul was overwhelmed and confused, and because he did not want to break down and cry on camera, he managed to stammer out only a short, simple response. "It's a drag." This brief statement immediately caused a huge controversy. Newspaper headlines screamed about Paul's supposedly cold reaction to John's death. Many fans were outraged, accusing Paul of being heartless and even suggesting he was happy about John's death. In reality, Paul was in shock and simply could not find the right words to express his complicated feelings. There were still unresolved conflicts between him and John. John had written cruel songs mocking Paul, and Paul had often complained about being looked down upon by his former partner. However, despite all their fights and disagreements, Paul still considered John his only true creative brother and musical soulmate. That is why John's death did not just take away a former friend, it also destroyed their last chance to sit down together, work out their differences, and maybe even make music together again. Paul once said in an interview that Mark Chapman did not just kill John, he stole a piece of the Beatles' soul and ended any hope that they could ever reconcile and be friends again. For decades, Paul has rarely mentioned Chapman's name in a normal way. Instead, he calls him a coward and a crazy person. Every time the Beatles are honored or celebrated by the public, Paul feels pain remembering that the image of all four of them together only exists in old photographs and memories and can never be brought back to life. But perhaps the most bitter part is that just a few weeks before his death, John had started talking about possibly working with Paul again. They had called each other and chatted in a friendly way, just like they used to do when they were young. But everything came to a complete stop on the night of December 8, 1980. Paul has carried this pain for his entire life, and Chapman's name represents everything he hates most. However, if Chapman was the person who pulled the trigger, there was another person behind the scenes who many people blame for the Beatles' breakup in the first place. Someone Paul can say, "There's the person he hates most of all." The fourth person on Paul's list is Yoko Ono, the woman he believes was behind the destruction of his friendship with John. Before 1968, the Beatles' recording studio was almost like a private sanctuary where only the four band members were allowed during their creative process. But when John Lennon brought Yoko Ono to sit beside him at every recording session, the atmosphere immediately changed for the worse. Yoko was known for having an extremely strong personality and wanting to control everything around John Lennon. Because of this, Paul, who was already a perfectionist and very strict about their work, became extremely annoyed. He saw Yoko's interference in their songwriting process and her direct involvement in musical discussions as a serious invasion of their creative space. Paul once admitted that he did not resent Yoko for being with John as his girlfriend, but he hated the way everything changed once she appeared in their lives. Many music historians and researchers believe that Yoko's presence was when the close friendship between John and Paul began to crack and fall apart. When the Beatles finally broke up, Paul repeatedly suggested that Yoko was the main cause. In many interviews, he often repeated his opinion that John had completely changed as a person since he had been with Yoko, and that John's musical and personal decisions from the late 1960s onward were directly influenced by his wife rather than his own independent thinking. On her side, Yoko Ono was not shy about attacking Paul McCartney in return. Yoko made no secret of her artistic and power ambitions. She saw her relationship with John Lennon not just as love, but as a partnership that would elevate both their names and reputations. She once said that John was the real creative genius, while Paul was only good at writing catchy, simple melodies that were not very deep or meaningful. These words were like a knife to Paul's pride, especially since he was a man who had spent his entire life wanting to be recognized as John's equal in terms of talent and creativity. One of the biggest ongoing conflicts between Paul and Yoko has been over song copyrights and credits. According to the original agreement, all Beatles songs were credited as Lennon-McCartney, regardless of which one of them was actually the main writer. After John's death, Yoko was determined to protect John's position and reputation. When Paul proposed changing some songs to McCartney-Lennon to better reflect who had really written what, Yoko fiercely objected and fought against it. Paul argued that he just wanted to correct the historical record and give proper credit where it was due, but Yoko saw this as an attempt to erase John's contributions and steal his legacy. This argument has lasted for decades, playing out in the press and through lawyers. Paul once said that Yoko wants to rewrite history in a way that only benefits her and John, but he cannot let that happen because it would be unfair and dishonest. In response, Yoko has repeatedly criticized Paul's music as being too simple and shallow, saying that compared to John's deeper, more meaningful songs, Paul's work was just empty entertainment music without real substance. She even went so far as to vote for Paul as the least important Beatle in a 1981 Rolling Stone magazine poll, which further damaged their relationship. It was not until the late 1990s, when Paul participated in the Beatles anthology project and helped re-release some of the band's classic recordings, that he and Yoko made some small gestures toward reconciliation. However, the deep distrust and resentment between them never completely disappeared. In one interview, Paul said with obvious bitterness that he does not hate Yoko as a person, but if it were not for her influence on John, the Beatles might have stayed together for several more years and created even more amazing music. The conflicts did not stop with outsiders. Even within the band itself, there were serious problems. The fifth person on Paul's hate list is George Harrison, his own bandmate, who had a heavy workplace conflict with Paul that created lasting professional wounds. Paul and George had serious problems over their different working styles and approaches to making music. In the recording studio, Paul was an extreme perfectionist who demanded everything be done exactly his way. He often ordered George to play his guitar parts exactly as Paul wanted them, even going so far as to direct him on every single note and chord. George was a very talented guitarist with his own creative ideas, but within the Beatles, he was always treated as less important than John Lennon or Paul McCartney when it came to songwriting. This made him feel more and more looked down upon and undervalued. During the recording of the album Let It Be, Paul constantly asked George to play a particular part over and over again, making small changes each time. The atmosphere in the studio became so tense and uncomfortable that George finally stood up, announced he was leaving, and walked out, leaving the rest of the band completely stunned and speechless. This was not the only time something like this happened. In many albums, the detailed guitar solos that George had carefully arranged and worked hard on were rejected or completely changed by Paul without much consideration for George's feelings. To George, this was not just criticism. It was a personal insult that pushed him out of the spotlight and made him feel like he was just an extra member in a band he had helped create. George often complained that Paul would not listen to his musical ideas or take his suggestions seriously. Even in later albums, many of the guitar parts and songs that George wrote were dismissed by Paul, while George desperately wanted to prove that he was a true songwriter and creative artist, not just a side musician who played what others told him to play. Although they maintained a polite relationship in public, George made no secret of his exhaustion and frustration with Paul's controlling behavior. In one interview, he stated bluntly that working with Paul was like having your hands tied behind your back, because Paul always thought he knew everything and was not willing to listen to other people's ideas. This conflict did not end when the Beatles broke up. George and Paul continued to clash in legal disputes over copyrights and control of their business company, Apple Corps. The truth is that there was never real harmony between them as creative partners. Paul, who wanted to control every single detail of their music, and George, who desperately wanted to be recognized as an independent musician with his own voice, were forever two opposite personalities who could never truly understand each other. It was Paul's musical tyranny and need to control everything that gradually turned George from a loyal Beatles member into a rebel who resented his treatment. But personal conflicts between band members were just the tip of the iceberg. What truly shattered the relationships between all of them came from outsiders, particularly one cunning business mogul who stepped in during the most chaotic time for the Beatles and made everything much worse. The sixth person Paul despises is Alan Klein, the business manager he considers a swindler who plotted to take over the Beatles and ultimately destroyed them. In 1967, after their beloved manager Brian Epstein died suddenly, the Beatles fell into a serious crisis. All four members were incredibly talented musicians, but none of them had any real business experience or knowledge. At that time, the Beatles' business empire was rapidly expanding to include Apple Films, Apple Corps, a recording studio, a retail store, and contracts with new artists. But everything was completely chaotic, and they were losing money rapidly. While John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr were confused and did not know what to do, Alan Klein appeared on the scene like a savior who promised to solve all their problems. Klein was already famous for managing successful acts like the Rolling Stones and Sam Cooke, and he had a reputation as someone who protected artists against greedy record company executives. He promised to make the Beatles richer than they had ever been before. From the very beginning, Paul McCartney was suspicious of Alan Klein's true motives and intentions. Paul thought Klein spoke too smoothly and seemed like he was lying about something. Instead, Paul wanted the Beatles to work with Eastman & Eastman, a respected law firm that happened to be run by his wife Linda McCartney's family, because he trusted them more and felt they would have the Beatles' best interests at heart. But John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr were all convinced by Klein's smooth talking and big promises. John particularly liked Klein because he claimed to tell the truth without beating around the bush, which appealed to John's direct personality. George and Ringo thought Paul was just being selfish and trying to favor his wife's family business, rather than thinking about what was best for the band. In 1969, all three members of the Beatles except Paul signed a contract making Klein their official manager. Paul was furious and absolutely refused to sign the contract. He knew that from that moment on, he would be outnumbered and sidelined in all major financial decisions affecting the band. Klein began to restructure Apple Corps by firing employees and cutting various projects. He did manage to help the Beatles increase their profits in the short term, which made the other three members think he was doing a good job. But Paul believed this was just a temporary trick, and that Klein was secretly stealing money from the band while appearing to help them. Paul's suspicions grew stronger as time went on, but the other three members would not listen to his warnings. Finally, on December 31, 1970, Paul McCartney did something that shocked the entire world. He sued the other three members of the Beatles in court. The lawsuit was not only intended to dissolve the group legally, but also to break their contract with Alan Klein. When the news broke that Paul McCartney was suing John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, the whole world was outraged and turned against Paul. Fans and the media saw him as a traitor and the person who killed the Beatles. But in reality, Paul was desperately trying to protect the band's interests and get them away from Klein's control. Just as Paul had predicted, a few years later, Klein was found guilty of financial fraud and various illegal business practices. Investigations revealed that he had taken much higher commissions than he had agreed to, secretly kept royalties that belonged to the artists, and was even prosecuted for tax evasion. In 1977, Klein was forced to repay the Beatles over $800,000 after they won a lawsuit against him. John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr finally had to admit bitterly that Paul had been right to be suspicious of Klein from the beginning. But by then, it was far too late. The Beatles had already broken up permanently, and there was no way to save the band or repair the damage that had been done. In later interviews, Paul has often mentioned that Alan Klein was the person who killed the Beatles both legally and financially. He has called Klein a swindler and a thief, and has never forgiven the other three members for turning their backs on him and joining forces with someone so dishonest. Klein destroyed the Beatles through legal and financial manipulation, but after the band's breakup, another person appeared who would create even more lasting damage to their legacy. The seventh person on Paul's hate list is Phil Spector, the music producer who ruined their final album, Let It Be. By 1970, the Beatles were on the verge of completely breaking up. The Get Back project, which Paul had hoped would be a simple, raw return to their musical roots, had become a mess of controversial and difficult recording sessions. When Alan Klein, whom Paul already hated, brought in Phil Spector to try to rescue the project and turn it into a finished album, everything immediately turned into a disaster. Phil Spector was famous for his wall-of-sound production style, where music was made to sound very grand, dense, and layered, almost like an entire orchestra hitting the listener all at once. But Paul did not want that kind of production at all for this particular album. His song, The Long and Winding Road, had been written as a quiet, sad, and gentle ballad, almost like a personal sigh or whisper. However, when Spector got his hands on the song, he completely transformed it into something Paul did not recognize. Spector brought in an entire symphony orchestra, brass instruments, and a female choir, which completely obscured Paul's original vocals and the simple, intimate feeling he had intended. Even worse, some of Paul's original vocal tracks were actually erased to make room for all the additional instrumental layers. When Paul first heard Spector's version, he was so angry he almost lost his mind. Paul immediately sat down and wrote a furious letter to Klein and Spector with very direct and harsh language, demanding that they remove all the strings, brass, choir, and what he called noisy stuff from his song. This was Paul's way of shouting that they had insulted him and completely destroyed his artistic vision. But all of Paul's requests and demands were completely ignored. In May 1970, the album Let It Be was released with Spector's heavy, high-handed production still intact. While Paul's song did reach the top of the American music charts, for him personally it felt like a dirty victory that meant nothing. He saw the final product as a betrayal and proof that the Beatles were no longer really the Beatles anymore. George Martin, the producer who had worked with the Beatles from their very beginning and understood their music better than anyone else, also could not stand what Spector had done. He sarcastically commented that the album should be credited as produced by George Martin and ruined by Phil Spector. As for Spector himself, he showed absolutely no remorse or regret for what he had done. Instead, he was arrogant and defensive, pointing out that Paul had been performing Spector's version of the song live for decades and that it had even won an Academy Award. Spector arrogantly declared that if Paul wanted to start a war over it, he had picked the wrong opponent. For Paul, this incident was a wound that would never heal properly. For many years afterward, he continued to mention it as the perfect example of how he had been betrayed by people who were supposed to be working for the Beatles' benefit. More than 30 years later, Paul finally got his revenge. In 2003, he released Let It Be, Naked, which stripped away everything that Spector had added to the original recordings. The Long and Winding Road was restored to its original form, simple, sincere, with only the raw sound of piano and vocals, just as Paul had originally intended. This was much more than just releasing another version of an old album. For Paul, it was a declaration of artistic independence and ownership. He was saying that he was the true owner of this music, and that nobody had the right to destroy or change his artistic vision without his permission,